Hello everybody! Today we're stepping things up a notch by modeling the front fender, which is a bit more complex. To give us a sense of scale, let's start things off by making the front tire visible. Next, bring up the gizmo. From the gizmo's gear, choose the cylinder 3D. Scale it up until it's visible and split unmasked points. After that, we're going to rotate it 90 degrees on the Y-axis and scale it up a bit more. Now let's turn off dynamic and then delete the center edge loop. On both ends of the cylinder, go ahead and inset the flat island. Next, you'll want to Q-mesh the polygroup island to create the hole. Now let's scale it on the Z-axis from the side view. Moving to the front view, Alt tag the two polys we want to Q-mesh. Go ahead and press Auto Groups and delete the unwanted island. Time to center the gizmo. From its gear, pick Deformer Soft. Here are a few handy hotkeys and tips for using the deformer. The orange cones adjust the deformer's resolution, while the red, blue, and green cones manage your symmetry based on the X, Y, and Z axis. Click on a point to select them, and Control drag to deselect. To invert the selection, tap Control on the canvas. Control dragging on the canvas will deselect all points. Press QC50, then turn off dynamic. This will crease the edges quickly. Divide the mesh once more, then delete the lower subdivisions. Go ahead and delete the side edge loop and perform a light polish by features to smooth out the mesh. This is a fast way to add a few more evenly spaced edge loops that will be useful for our next step. Let's do a Deformer Soft from the top view and scale the selected points in the X-axis. We're going for a slight taper where the rear part of the fender is wider. Now we can press Group by Normals. Then we can choose the top poly group and delete it. Delete the middle edge loop, and from the ZBrush, select Insert for the edge action, multiple edge loops for the target, and interactive elevation for the modifier. Next, let's press Uncrease All and snap the model to the side view. Grab the Move Infinite Depth brush and start making some adjustments based on the reference. I often have a few good reference views set up at specific angles. I use a plugin called Mad Pony Toolbag to save my camera views. You can assign hotkeys to these views for easy swapping between angles and camera views. Another way you can do it in ZBrush is you can use the Z app link in the document palette or the timeline in the movie palette. Next, let's switch to the top view and make some more adjustments with the Move Infinite Depth brush. I'm aiming to adjust the front and back fender shapes. Then start moving the points at the ends to match it up better when we start extruding the sides. To preserve the changes we just made around the model's border when polishing, we need to run a mask by features with the border selected. Now we can use polish by features to smooth out the fender's faces. Let's clear the mask, and it's time to grab the ZBrush. For the edge action, select Extrude, and for the target, choose Edge. So here's a feature that I would love to see implemented into ZBrush. Imagine being able to extrude edges with the gizmo, just like we can with the polys. It would be an insane turbo boost to the modeling process. Let's unmask the edges and get that gizmo right in the middle. Alright, scale these edges so they're flush. And then snap it to the side view. Now we'll move them down. After we clear the mask, we'll extrude the edges down using the ZBrush. Single tap Alt to extrude the partial edge loop. Let's unmask those edges and try to match the location and scale to our reference. For the align edge action, we'll want edge strip and straight lines as our target, with specified curvature set to 0 for the modifier. Now we can go ahead and mirror and weld in the X-axis. Let's go back to the edge action of extrude and tap Alt once to get back to a single edge extrude. A cool feature of the edge extrude is it snaps and welds points that are nearby to each other. Unmask the edges and scale on the x-axis with the local symmetry turned on. Then we'll snap it to the side view and move them down just a tiny bit. Let's also move the point a little closer to the front, then extrude the edges down a bit more. Unmask those edges and position them into place. Then switch to the top view and flare them out a little. Clear the mask and extrude the edge again. This time we're trying to line them up with the other extrusions. Now remember, we want to switch back and forth between the top and side view. This helps to get the shape as close as possible to the reference. Let's go ahead and select transpose for the polygon action and single poly for the target. Alt tag the 6 faces and scale them flush with local symmetry turned on. Here's a quick tip. Alt-clicking on a point or surface of a mesh with the gizmo will snap the gizmo to that point or face. And if you hold down the pen or mouse click, you can aim the gizmo in the direction you want. Now you'll notice as you're rotating the gizmo, it will snap to vertices. This makes it possible to align the gizmo based on vertex to vertex or face to vertex. Next, switch to Insert Single Edge Loop and then unmask that edge loop. Alt-click on the point to align the gizmo and scale in the edge loop. Clear the mask and extrude a single edge. Let's switch to Slide by Brush Size to reposition the point. Go ahead and unmask the edge and use the gizmo to match the reference. We'll add some more edge loops to the yellow poly group. Then go ahead and unmask those 5 points and scale them flush. Now we can start bridging the faces over using the extrude action in the ZBrush brush. Alt tag the poly loop and transpose a single poly. Go ahead and clear the mask, and from the ZBrush brush, select Slide by Brush Size to adjust the point's position. So let's dive into my thought process for a second, especially when I'm eyeballing a model like the front fender. The first thing I typically do is mentally break it down into basic shapes. Like, does any part of it resemble a box, a sphere, a cylinder? And do these shapes make up the main form of the model? For instance, with the front fender, we began with a cylinder as our primary shape, then worked our way outwards to model the rest of the fender. As the model evolves, it often starts to take on forms that look less like our primitive shapes. That's when I start focusing on angles and plane changes. Now this is where references become super crucial. The more angles you can get of your model, the more information you'll have at your disposal. But where do you get these references? Google is the obvious answer, right? However, here's the thing I've noticed. Some artists just Google the model's title or main name and then call it a day. And that might work for simple props, but for detailed models, you're going to have to dig a little bit deeper. One thing I often do is expand a keyword search by learning part names. Try out different years it was manufactured. Look for stores that sell different parts, or hunt down online technical manuals that break each part down to its nuts and bolts. Another thing you can do is rather than just grabbing an image from Google, try visiting the actual website. The images there are often larger and more detailed, and they might even have additional photos that Google didn't index. You can also look for videos. YouTube is an awesome place to find angles you might have missed. Then there's also websites dedicated solely to collecting images, both paid and for free. It's worth giving them a quick search. Another great way to gather references is to go out and snap photos yourself. This method can yield top quality references and capture hard to find angles. However, its feasibility depends on several factors. Firstly, how accessible is the reference? If I'm aiming to model a cutting edge fighter jet, well, I'm probably out of luck. Secondly, if I'm really struggling to find anything online, then it might be time to dust off the camera. Thirdly, the importance of the project is a factor. Is it for a client making the effort worth it? Or is it a personal project that I plan on keeping in my portfolio for some time? Finally, time is a factor. If I'm racing against the clock, it might be wiser just to stick to online sources. So we talked about photo references, but what about blueprints? That can be a bit tricky. Should you model from blueprints alone? Personally, in most cases, I say no. And here's why. They usually don't show every part of the model. And line drawings don't paint the full picture. For instance, like modeling a car, some parts like the inside of the lights aren't shown. Most interiors are not included, and a lot of fasteners are missing. Now the question is, can I use blueprints as a starting point for the blockout stage? My answer to that is only if it's high quality blueprints. You don't want to rely on poorly drawn blueprints with wonky proportions to start blocking out your model. While I'm not the biggest fan of blueprints, I'm not one to dismiss anything that might help me reach my end goal. Jumping back to our front fender, the first task on our list is some essential cleanup. Let's make sure our edges have uniform thickness and the surface is free from any major imperfections. Then go ahead and press Ctrl W to group visible. Rotate it to the front view and let's keep on extruding upwards. At certain times, it's a whole lot simpler to just delete the polys and bridge the edges, instead of struggling to snap the points together. Switch over to the point action of slide and modify the thickness of the edges. Go ahead and press Ctrl W to group visible, then mirror and weld on the x-axis. It's time to grab the Move Infinite Depth brush and start moving any points that aren't straying too far out. Next, switch to Mask a Single Poly and turn on Symmetry on the x-axis. Alt-tag the front polys and invert the mask. Now run a Polish by Features, then dial back the effect using the Adjust Last slider. You'll find the Adjust Last slider in the Stroke palette. Let's go ahead and clear the mask by control dragging on the canvas. Next, we'll snap to the top view and end an edge loop right in the center. Following that, let's edge extrude the rear part of the fender. Unmask the edges and move them downwards. Hold Alt to unlock the gizmo, and rotate it to match the edge flow of the mesh. Now we can scale it along the Z-axis. Unmask by control dragging on the canvas. Then switch over to the Move Infinite Depth brush to make point-by-point adjustments for the curvature. Move the last point inwards to help create the rounded edge. Unmask the edges and rotate them inward to add a touch more taper. Now switch to the Z brush and delete the poly. Then bridge the edges together. Press Ctrl W to group visible. Make a couple last adjustments before we head over to the lower part of the fender. Change to the edge extrude and fill in the bottom polys. Unmask the edges using Ctrl and Alt, then use the Clip Curve brush to straighten them out. Now we're going to set up our edge loops so we can create the hole. A handy tip here is to aim for 4 polys of similar size. If the polys aren't equal, it will distort the circle we're creating from the point split. There are ways around this, but it's better to avoid it if possible. Now we can go to Inset Polygroup All to add an edge loop. The reason I specifically select Inset is that it adds a polygroup with the edge loop. Now select QMesh Polygroup All and hold Shift to switch it to a move operation. Then do a regular QMesh Polygroup All. Select the inner polygroup, reverse the selection, and delete hidden. Once you've given it a quick inspection, press Ctrl W. The front of the fender still seems a bit off. Snap it to the top view and select the Move Infinite Depth brush. We can now switch to Extrude All Polygons. I prefer Extrude over QMesh in this scenario because I don't want any unintentional welding if the polys become too close. Go ahead and flip the faces and press QC50. From the Z brush, select Crease Edge Loop Partial. This is the moment where you start to see all the hard work start to pay off. Adding in creases isn't always straightforward. Constant reference checking is definitely needed. Now it's time to make some tough calls on what needs creasing and what areas could use supporting edge loops for greater control. This stage is also where you bite spots of modeling areas that need backtracking and reworking. After we've got all the creases in place, It's time to drop the crease level down to 2 and switch off the polyframe to check out our work we've done so far. Let's add an edge loop and mask off the bottom 3 edges. Invert the mask and use the gizmo to move the edge strip inwards. To alleviate some tension, slide the edge loop upwards. For these edges, we need to push them inward a bit for a better overall effect. Let's go ahead and mask off these edges, invert the mask, and move them down slightly using the gizmo. Clear the mask and give your work a final once-over. Now the pinching of the hole is just a matter of welding some extra points together. Now there are a couple of last-minute fixes we need to address. The first one involves lowering this point to straighten out that line. Disabling dynamic will make this task easier. Take your time aligning the other points too. Another issue that's bugging me is the uneven flat surface on the side. From the ZBrush, select Transpose a single poly and Alt tag the 8 faces. Activate local symmetry and scale on the Z axis. You can do a rotate if needed. Let's turn dynamic subdivisions back on and see how it's shaping up.